Nobody warned him. Nobody told him that the higher you climb, the harder the world tries to pull you down. Because what happened to Michael Jackson during the darkest years of his life was never fully shown to the public. What the cameras caught was only a fraction of the truth. The real story, the one buried beneath decades of headlines, court documents, and carefully managed narratives, is far more complex, far more heartbreaking, and far more disturbing than anything the tabloids ever printed. Because Michael Jackson wasn't just a pop star facing controversy. He was a human being, being consumed alive by a machine he helped create. And what you're about to hear was never meant to be told this way. It started long before the world noticed. Long before the accusations. Long before the trial. It started in a small house in Gary, Indiana, where a little boy with an extraordinary voice was learning a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. That talent is not protection. That fame is not safety. That the spotlight can be the most dangerous place on earth. Michael Joe Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, the seventh of 10 children, in a working-class family where money was tight and expectations were tighter. His father, Joseph Jackson, spotted something in Michael early. Something rare, something that could be monetized. And from that moment forward, Michael's childhood became secondary to Michael's potential. The rehearsals were brutal, the pressure was relentless, and the fear of failure was installed so deeply in Michael's nervous system that it never fully left him. Not at 25, not at 40, not ever. By the time Michael Jackson was 10 years old, he was already a professional. Already performing on stages that grown men spent decades trying to reach. The Jackson 5 were exploding. Motown had signed them. America was falling in love. But behind the matching outfits and the synchronized dance moves, something was being quietly destroyed. Michael's childhood, not stolen in a dramatic single moment, but slowly, methodically dismantled, rehearsal by rehearsal, performance by performance, until the boy who should have been riding bikes and making friends existed only as a performer. A product, a vehicle for other people's ambitions. And that wound, that foundational crack in his sense of self, would become the fault line that everything else eventually collapsed into. The 1980s arrived, and Michael Jackson did something no artist had ever done before. He didn't just become famous. He became a phenomenon. Thriller, released in November 1982, didn't just break records. It shattered the entire framework that records were measured by. 66 million copies sold. 14 months on the Billboard charts. 7 Grammy Awards in a single night. The first music video to be preserved in the Library of Congress. Numbers that don't just represent success, they represent a category of achievement that existed before Michael, and has never been replicated since. But here's what nobody talks about when they talk about Thriller. The pressure that came after it. Because when you create the best-selling album in human history, you don't get to rest. You don't get to breathe. You get handed a higher bar. An impossible standard. And then the world watches, waiting to see if you can clear it. And that pressure began doing something to Michael that the public couldn't see yet. The changes were subtle at first. A restructured nose, lighter skin, a face that seemed to be in a state of constant, quiet transformation. The tabloids noticed immediately. The questions started. The theories multiplied. And Michael retreated. Not from the spotlight. He couldn't escape that. But from the world of ordinary human connection. From the kind of casual, unguarded moments that most people take for granted. He built walls, literal ones, at a 2,700-acre estate in Los Olivos, California that he named Neverland. And inside those walls, he tried to build something he had never actually experienced. A childhood. His childhood. The one that had been taken from him before he was old enough to understand what was being taken. But that's not even the craziest part. Because Neverland wasn't just an escape. It wasn't just a mansion with a zoo and an amusement park and a movie theater. It was a symptom, a monument to grief so profound, that Michael had to construct it in physical space just to make it real. He invited children to visit. He saw in them something he had lost and could never recover. And the world, which had celebrated him for decades, suddenly turned. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the kind of speed that only mass media can generate when it finds a target that cannot effectively fight back. In 1993, the accusation came. Jordan Chandler, a 13-year-old boy. His father, Evan Chandler. And a story that exploded across every television screen, every newspaper front page, every radio broadcast on Earth. Michael Jackson was accused of child sexual abuse. And the world stopped. What followed was not just a legal battle. It was a psychological demolition. Because Michael Jackson had spent his entire life building an image. Not a manufactured, cynical image, but something he genuinely believed in. The idea that he was a force for love, for healing, for childhood wonder in a world that had grown too cynical to remember what that felt like. And now that image was being shredded. In public, daily, with relentless, merciless efficiency. The 1993 investigation lasted months. Police searched Neverland. Investigators conducted a humiliating physical examination of Michael's body. His private spaces were violated. His private life was exposed. And through all of it, Michael Jackson maintained his innocence. But the damage to his psyche was something no courtroom verdict could ever repair. The case was settled out of court in 1994. No criminal charges were filed. The settlement, reportedly around $23 million, was later twisted by the media into implied guilt. As if the act of settling was itself a confession. But what almost nobody reported was that Michael's legal team settled because continuing the case would have required Michael himself to testify in graphic detail about accusations so personal, so invasive, so psychologically devastating, that his advisors feared the trial itself might break him completely. Not the verdict, the process, the act of reliving it, defending it, dissecting it in front of the world. And so a check was written. And the check became the story. And the story became the legend. And the legend buried the man. But nobody expected what happened next. Because instead of retreating permanently, Michael Jackson came back. He released History in 1995. A double album, 30 tracks, 1 disc of greatest hits, and 1 disc of new material so raw, so emotionally exposed, that listening to it felt like reading someone's private diary. Songs like Scream, recorded with his sister Janet, where the rage and exhaustion of a man who had been publicly destroyed were compressed into 4 minutes of controlled total, that it didn't sound like a pop song. It sounded like a confession from inside a prison no one else could see. History sold 20 million copies worldwide. Because even broken, Michael Jackson could communicate something to the human heart that no one else could reach. The late 1990s brought a kind of uneasy quiet. But quiet for Michael Jackson was never truly peaceful. It was the quiet of a man constantly bracing for the next impact. His marriages, first to Lisa Marie Presley in 1994, then to Debbie Rowe in 1996, were dissected, doubted, and dismissed by a media that had already decided what Michael Jackson was allowed to be. His children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, became both his greatest source of joy and his most visible vulnerability. He loved them with a fierceness that was visible even through the masks and veils he used to protect their identities. But the world that had once adored him, now watched everything he did with suspicion. And that surveillance, that constant, suffocating scrutiny, was changing him in ways that were becoming impossible to hide. And then it happened again. In 2003, British journalist Martin Bashir released a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson. And what it showed sent shockwaves through every country on earth. Michael, holding hands with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Arvizo. Michael, speaking openly about sharing his bedroom with children. Michael, seemingly unaware, or simply unable to comprehend, how the images being captured would be received by a world that had already made up its mind about him. Within hours of the documentary airing, the calls for investigation had begun. Within weeks, Michael Jackson was arrested. On November 20, 2003, at his Neverland Ranch, he was handcuffed, photographed, fingerprinted. The mugshot went around the world. And for Michael Jackson, something inside him broke that day that was never fully repaired. The trial of 2005 became the most watched legal proceeding of its era. More cameras, more coverage, more daily dissection of a human being's private life than almost any event in television history. Michael arrived at court each day looking increasingly fragile, increasingly diminished. A man who had once commanded stadiums of 100,000 people, now walked into a courtroom looking like someone who was slowly disappearing. The testimony was brutal, the accusations were detailed, the defense was aggressive, and the jury, after deliberating for 7 days, returned a verdict of not guilty on all 14 counts. Not guilty, on every single charge. Michael Jackson walked out of that courthouse a free man, legally speaking. But freedom is a complicated thing. Because the trial had cost him something that no verdict could return. His sense of safety in the world. His belief that he could exist without being hunted. After the acquittal, Michael left America. He took his children and he left. He lived in Bahrain for a period, as a guest of a member of the royal family. He traveled. He kept a low profile in a way that was genuinely new for him. And those close to him during that period described someone who was deeply, genuinely traumatized. Not performing trauma for cameras. Not manufacturing victimhood, but living inside a level of psychological damage that had accumulated over decades, and was now presenting itself in ways that could manage or medicated away. He was consuming prescription medication at levels that alarmed people around him. Painkillers, sedatives, medications that had originally been prescribed for legitimate physical pain. His scalp had been severely burned during the famous 1984 Pepsi commercial accident, but that had gradually become something else. Something more necessary, something he could not function without. The financial picture was also deteriorating in ways the public didn't fully understand. Because the image of Michael Jackson as endlessly wealthy, as someone so rich that money was simply not a variable in his life, was not entirely accurate. Neverland cost an estimated $5 million per year just to maintain. His lifestyle, the art collection, the staff, the travel, the security, consumed resources at a rate that even his extraordinary earnings struggled to sustain. And the deals he had made, the loans he had taken against his share of the Sony ATV music publishing catalog, a catalog that included the Beatles' entire library, purchased for $47.5 million in 1985 in one of the most brilliant financial moves in music history, were now creating pressure that was closing in from multiple directions simultaneously. Michael Jackson was asset-rich and cash-poor, a situation that made him dependent on people whose interests were not always aligned with his own. And that dependency opened doors that should have stayed closed. The people who surrounded him during his most vulnerable years were not always the people who had his best interests at heart. There were managers who managed for themselves, doctors who prescribed without adequate concern for consequences, advisors who advised in directions that benefited their own positions. And Michael, isolated, traumatized, exhausted, and increasingly disconnected from the kind of grounded human relationships that might have provided perspective, could not always distinguish between those who loved him and those who were simply positioned near the love he generated in everyone around him. That distinction, that inability to clearly see who was real and who was performing, may have been the most tragic consequence of a lifetime spent in the spotlight. By 2008, the financial pressure had reached a critical point. A deal was structured for Michael to perform a series of concerts at London's O2 Arena. 10 shows, initially, but the promoters, AEG Live, had their own pressures, their own financial calculations. The 10 shows became 50. 50 concerts scheduled across a grueling period. This Is It was the name of the tour. And everyone around Michael seemed to believe it was his comeback, his resurrection, his return to the arena he had always owned. But people close to Michael described a different reality. A man who was exhausted before the rehearsals even began, who struggled physically in ways that made people quietly, privately worried. Who was brilliant when he found the energy to be brilliant, and visibly depleted when he couldn't. The tension between what the tour required, and what Michael Jackson actually had left to give, was a contradiction that nobody in a position of authority chose to resolve. And then came the morning of June 25, 2009. A Thursday. A morning that began like any other morning in a rented mansion in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles. Except that Michael Jackson did not wake up. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, had administered propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic, to help Michael sleep. A practice that had apparently been ongoing for weeks. And in the hours that followed, Michael's heart stopped. By the time paramedics arrived, by the time the emergency room doctors at UCLA Medical Center attempted everything they could attempt, it was already too late. At 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. The world's reaction was unlike anything that had occurred since the death of a head of state. The internet, still relatively young as a real-time news medium, struggled to handle the traffic. Google initially thought it was under a cyber attack because so many people were simultaneously searching for Michael Jackson's name. Twitter crashed. Wikipedia crashed. TMZ, which broke the story before any major network confirmed it, became the most visited news site on Earth for a period of hours. And in cities across every continent, people gathered, not because they had been organized to gather, but because something instinctive, something deeply human, compelled them toward each other. Because what had been lost was not just a performer. It was something harder to name, something that had been part of the emotional landscape of the entire world for 4 decades. Conrad Murray was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter, sentenced to 4 years in prison. He served 2, and in the years that followed Michael's death, the questions didn't stop. They multiplied, because death, for Michael Jackson, did not bring the peace that is supposed to follow controversy. The allegations continued, documentaries were made, counter-arguments were constructed. The debate about who Michael Jackson really was, what he did and didn't do, what was true and what was fabricated, what was justice and what was persecution, became one of the most contested questions in the history of popular culture. And that debate, that irresolvable, permanent, exhausting debate, may itself be the most fitting reflection of the life he lived. A life so large, so contradictory, so genuinely unprecedented, that even death couldn't contain it within a simple narrative. What remains is the music. Hundreds of songs, dozens of albums, a catalog that continues to generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually. A body of work so technically accomplished, so emotionally sophisticated, so deeply embedded in the global cultural consciousness, that it will almost certainly outlast everyone alive today who is arguing about it. Billie Jean, Beat It, Man in the Mirror, Heal the World, Earth Song, songs that don't just entertain, songs that locate something in the human experience that couldn't be located any other way. That is not an accident. That is not luck. That is the product of a level of artistic devotion so total, so all-consuming, that it required the sacrifice of nearly everything else. The childhood, the privacy, the safety, the peace, the ordinary human life that Michael Jackson never got to live, and perhaps never fully stopped grieving. Because that is the thing about Michael Jackson's most difficult years that never quite fits into the headlines or the verdicts or the documentaries. The difficulty wasn't just external. It wasn't just the accusations or the trials or the financial pressure or the media persecution, real and devastating as all of those things were. The difficulty was internal. The difficulty was a man trying to exist in a world that had decided what he was, before he had fully decided what he was himself. A man trying to find love in a context where love and exploitation wore the same face. A man trying to hold on to wonder in circumstances specifically designed to destroy it. And in the end, the most honest thing that can be said about the king of pop's darkest years is that they reveal not a monster, not a saint, but something far more uncomfortable. A human being, fragile, extraordinary, irreplaceable, and completely, heartbreakingly alone inside the biggest spotlight the world has ever aimed at a single person. The last question, the one that still doesn't have a clean answer, is whether it had to end this way. Whether the machine that built Michael Jackson was always also going to be the machine that destroyed him. Whether the world that loved him ever truly knew how to love him in a way he could actually receive. And whether the man behind the glove, behind the moonwalk, behind the music that changed everything, ever got even one moment of the peace he spent his whole life trying to create. That question hangs in the air, unanswered, and maybe that's exactly where it belongs.